Hey guys, tonight we're crawling into one of the weirdest corners of medical history. A drug that was invented to be a miracle, promoted as the safest anesthetic ever made, quietly demoted to horse tranquilizer, and then somehow ended up being sprinkled onto parsley and sold in a parking lot behind a laundromat. Tonight we're talking about PCP, the compound that got fired from 3 separate careers and kept coming back. Before we start, thank you sincerely to the listener who suggested this one. I read every comment, and honestly, most of the best topics on this channel came from you lot rather than from me. If you enjoy this, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because it's apparently always 2 in the morning somewhere. Quick note as well. The channel is now on Spotify, link in the description, if you'd rather fall asleep without a screen glowing at you like a tiny interrogation lamp. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and let your shoulders drop about 2 inches from where you're currently holding them. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered how a drug gets invented by serious men in white coats and ends up with a street name that sounds like a heavy metal band? Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be fully awake, fully conscious, and completely unable to locate your own legs? What happens when a chemist is asked to make surgery safer and accidentally makes something that erases the floor? Why did an entire nation spend the late 1970s convinced that one drug could turn a man into a freight train? And how does a compound go from operating theatres to zoo enclosures to a cigarette dipped in a jar behind somebody's kitchen sink? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up in 1956 in a laboratory in Detroit, wearing a lab coat that doesn't fit, holding a flask of something clear, and being told by a very cheerful supervisor that this one is going to change medicine forever. He's right. Just not in the way anyone hoped. Let's start where everything starts, with a company, a deadline, and a chemist who just wants to go home. The place is Parke Davis, one of the great pharmaceutical houses of the American Midwest, sitting on the Detroit River like a cathedral of pills. It's the middle of the 1950s, the golden age of the wonder drug, when every laboratory in the country believes it is roughly 18 months away from curing something enormous. The air smells like solvent and floor wax. Somewhere down the hall, a man named Victor Maddox is working through a series of piperidine compounds, one after another, the way you might work through a bag of chips, without ceremony, without fanfare, and without any sense that number 7 is going to ruin the next 40 years. You need to understand what this building felt like in 1956, because it wasn't a sinister place. It was optimistic to the point of being slightly ridiculous. Penicillin had already rewritten the rules. The polio vaccine had arrived the year before and turned a virologist into a national hero. Pharmaceutical research in this decade had roughly the same cultural energy as a space program, and Detroit had one of the best programs going. Men in identical white coats walked identical corridors carrying beakers toward an identical future in which nobody suffered anymore. It's the kind of confidence that only exists right before something goes sideways. The work itself was profoundly unglamorous. Picture the bench, glassware racked in rows, a fume hood grumbling like an old refrigerator, notebooks filled with handwriting nobody but the author will ever decode. Maddox was building variations on a chemical theme, tweaking a molecule here, swapping a ring there, generating a family of related compounds and handing them off to the pharmacology department to see whether any of them did anything interesting to a mouse. This is how most drug discovery actually worked, and largely still does. It is not a lightning bolt. It is a man making 400 slightly different versions of the same thing, and waiting for someone else to tell him which one matters. The compound in question was assigned a code, because compounds are always assigned codes before they're assigned personalities. It was phencyclidine, though nobody called it that yet, and internally it wore the designation CI395 like a hospital wristband. At this stage it was not angel dust. It was not a street drug. It was not a headline. It was a clear substance in a labelled container on a shelf in Michigan, sitting quietly among its siblings, indistinguishable from the compounds on either side of it, waiting for someone to notice. And here's the thing nobody in that building could possibly have known. They had just made one of the most consequential molecules of the 20th century, and they had made it by accident, while looking for something else, using a process that had all the drama of assembling flat-pack furniture. There was no moment of triumph. No one shouted. No one dropped anything. The most important thing that happened in Detroit that year was catalogued, filed, and forgotten within about a week. It's a bit like discovering that the guy who invented the internet did it while trying to organize his recipes. History adores a lightning bolt, and reality keeps handing us a man in a cardigan doing paperwork. So the compound went into the queue. It would be tested on animals, then on people, then celebrated, then quietly withdrawn, then demoted to veterinary work, then stolen, then copied in bathtubs, then blamed for a decade of American fear, then finally understood, and then, in the strangest twist of all, would go on to spawn a medicine that pulls people back from severe depression in a matter of hours. All of it starting with a tired chemist, a numbered flask, and absolutely nobody paying attention. Let's talk about the problem they were trying to solve, because it's grimmer than you'd think. In the 1950s, being put under for surgery was still a genuine gamble. The anesthetics of the day worked by dialing your entire nervous system down towards zero, which is wonderful for pain and unfortunate for breathing. Blood pressure fell, hearts wobbled. Occasionally somebody went to sleep for a hernia repair and simply declined to come back. Anesthesiologists spent their careers standing at the head of a table performing a slow, careful balancing act between unconscious and dead. What everyone wanted was a drug that should switch off the suffering without switching off the patient. And in 1956, in a Detroit laboratory, somebody thought they'd found it. To appreciate why this mattered, sit with the physics of it for a moment. Every classical general anesthetic works by suppression. Ether, chloroform, the barbiturates, the newer inhaled agents arriving in that era, all of them essentially turn down the volume knob on the entire central nervous system. The trouble is that the knob controls everything. Turn it far enough to abolish the pain of a scalpel, and you're also turning down the part of the brainstem that reminds your lungs to keep going. Turn it a little further, and you've turned that part off completely. There is no separate dial. It is one knob, and every surgery was a negotiation with it. Imagine driving a car where the accelerator and the brakes are the same pedal, and the difference between them is about a centimetre. That was anesthesia. Now imagine doing that for 6 hours while someone's abdomen is open and a man with a saw is asking you questions. The consequences were not theoretical. Patients with weak hearts were often considered too risky to operate on at all, which meant that a condition entirely curable with surgery could still kill you, purely because nobody could safely put you to sleep long enough to fix it. Elderly patients, patients in shock, patients who had already lost blood in an accident, all of them faced anaesthetists who had to weigh the operation against the very real possibility that the anaesthetic would finish what the injury started. Battlefield medicine had the same problem, only louder, dirtier, and with less equipment. So the wish list was specific, and everybody in the field could recite it. You wanted profound pain relief. You wanted the patient still. You wanted the blood pressure to hold steady rather than falling through the floor. And most of all, you wanted the patient to keep breathing on their own, because ventilators in this era were scarce, cumbersome, and not something you wanted to rely on for a routine procedure in a small hospital in a small town. Nothing did all four. Everything did two, maybe three, and then charged you for the fourth in some unpleasant currency. The profession had essentially accepted this as a permanent feature of the universe, the way you accept that your knees are going to make that noise now. Which is why, when the animal data on this new compound started coming back, the people reading it had to check it twice, because the numbers on the page were describing a drug that appeared to do all four at once, not two, not three with an asterisk. All four, in monkeys, repeatedly, in a way that held up across trials. That is the moment where this whole story turns, and it turns on a genuinely noble impulse. Nobody was trying to invent a street drug. Nobody was trying to make anyone hallucinate. They were trying to stop people dying on operating tables, which is about as respectable a project as human beings have ever undertaken. They just had no idea what they were about to open. It's time for the good news portion of the evening, which will last approximately one segment. The compound was tested on animals first, and the animals were spectacular. Monkeys went still, calm, and utterly unbothered. You could operate. You could poke. Nothing hurt them. And here's the part that made the pharmacologist Graham Chen sit up straight. Their blood pressure held. Their hearts kept time. Their breathing carried on like nothing was happening, because as far as the lungs were concerned, nothing was. This was the Holy Grail wearing a name tag. They called it Cernal, from the word serenity, which in hindsight is the single most optimistic branding decision in the history of the pharmaceutical industry. Picture the laboratory the morning those first results came in. A room with too much fluorescent light, a stack of charts, and a small crowd of people leaning over a desk making the specific noise that scientists make when a result is better than expected. It is not a cheer. It is more of a low, suspicious hum, because the first instinct of anyone competent is to assume the equipment is broken. The equipment was not broken. Chen and his colleagues ran the compound through the standard battery of animal work, and it kept performing. Dogs, cats, rodents, and most impressively primates all responded with the same profound, unbothered stillness. Surgical procedures could be carried out. The animals showed no distress, and the vital signs, which is the part everybody kept rereading, stayed almost boringly normal throughout. In some cases, blood pressure actually went up slightly, which is the exact opposite of the problem every other anesthetic on the market had. There was one oddity that everyone noticed, and nobody knew what to do with. The animals didn't look asleep. Their eyes were often open. They had a strange, fixed, faraway quality about them, present in the room but not in any way participating in it. A dog under ether looks like a dog having a nap. A monkey under this compound looked like a monkey who had received some upsetting personal news and was thinking it over. It was noted in the write-ups. It was flagged as unusual. And then everyone moved on because the vital signs were beautiful and the vital signs were the whole point. You can hardly blame them. When you've spent 20 years watching patients turn grey on the table and someone hands you a compound where that simply doesn't happen, the fact that the subject is staring into the middle distance feels like an eccentricity rather than a warning. The name is where the story gets almost embarrassing. Cernal, from Serenity, chosen presumably in a meeting room by people who are feeling extremely good about themselves. There is a particular flavour of 1950s confidence in that decision. The same confidence that gave us leaded petrol, radium wristwatches, and cigarette advertisements featuring actual physicians. It is the confidence of an era that had not yet been humbled. By 1957, the compound was moving toward human trials, and the internal expectation was that this was going to be enormous. Not a modest improvement, a generational leap. The kind of drug that gets its inventor written into textbooks and its manufacturer written into share prices. And for a little while, in the operating theatre itself, it delivered exactly that. The surgeries went well. Patients felt nothing. Vital signs held. If the story ended at the moment the last suture went in, this drug would be remembered today as one of the triumphs of 20th century medicine, and you would have never heard of it, because things that work quietly never make it onto channels like this one. But surgery doesn't end when the surgery ends. It ends when the patient wakes up. And that, it turned out, was where they had a problem. Now let's talk about the surgeries themselves, because the operations went beautifully. It was the afterward that caused problems. Human trials began in the late 1950s, and by every measurement that mattered on a clipboard, the drug performed. Patients felt no pain. Vital signs stayed politely within range. Surgeons were delighted. Then the patients started coming back up, and they came back up strange. Some were agitated, some were confused for hours, some stared at the ceiling and described things that were not on the ceiling. A few became convinced that parts of their body belonged to someone else. Recovery rooms in the 1950s were not designed for this. Recovery rooms in the 1950s were designed for groaning. Let's set the scene properly. A post-operative ward in this era was a long room with rows of iron-framed beds, a nurse or two, a trolley, and a general atmosphere of institutional beige. The expected soundtrack was moaning, retching, and the occasional request for water. Recovery was assumed to be a passive process that happened to a patient while everyone else got on with the next case. It required patience, a bucket, and a blanket. What arrived instead was a person who was awake, who could sometimes talk, and who was reporting from a location that did not exist. The clinical term the doctors eventually settled on was emergence reactions, which is the medical profession's gift for making a thunderstorm sound like a filing error. In practice, emergence reactions covered an extraordinary range. Some patients were merely disoriented and drifted back within an hour or two, mildly embarrassed. Others spent a full working day somewhere else. There were patients who became frightened, patients who became convinced that the staff intended them harm, and patients who became physically combative in a way that required more hands than the ward could supply. The body ownership reports were the ones that unsettled people most. Patients described their arm as belonging to the person in the next bed. Patients described watching their own legs from a distance and feeling no particular connection to them. One recurring theme was the sensation of floating above the bed and looking down at a body that was technically theirs but felt, at best, like a rental. Try to hold that in your head for a second. You went in for a routine procedure. You woke up perfectly conscious, perfectly capable of speech, and completely unable to establish diplomatic relations with your own left hand. It's a bit like your phone updating overnight and moving every single app to a new position. Everything is still there. Everything still works. You simply cannot find any of it, and the whole experience makes you quietly furious. For the nursing staff, this created a very practical crisis. Nurses were suddenly required to manage a patient who was neither asleep nor awake, neither in pain nor comfortable, neither cooperative nor deliberately difficult, and who could shift between calm and distressed without any warning at all. There was no protocol, there was no training, there was a night shift, a corridor, and a person having an experience that nobody in the building had a vocabulary for. And here's the detail that made the whole thing so hard to argue with. The surgery had been a success. The anesthetic had done exactly what it was designed to do. The patient had not lost blood pressure, had not stopped breathing, had not required resuscitation. By the standards the drug had been built to meet, it was flawless. It had simply, somewhere between the incision and the recovery ward, misplaced the patient. Reports piled up through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, first as curiosities, then as case series, then as a pattern nobody could pretend was rare. Something was very wrong with the miracle. Now medicine had to work out what to call it. Let's talk about vocabulary, because this drug forced doctors to invent a new one. The problem was that nothing in the existing dictionary fit. The patient wasn't asleep. The patient wasn't sedated in any normal sense. The patient's eyes were often open. The patient could sometimes speak. And yet the patient was not, in any meaningful way, present. The mind had not been switched off. It had been unplugged from the body and left running in another room. Anesthesiologists reached for the word dissociation, and it stuck, and it remains the single most accurate three-syllable summary of the experience anyone has ever managed. Your body is having surgery. You are elsewhere. Nobody has your forwarding address. This sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. In medicine, having no word for something is genuinely dangerous, because you cannot study what you cannot describe, and you certainly cannot write it in a chart. Before this, anesthesia was understood as a sliding scale from fully awake to fully unconscious, with everything in between arranged in a neat line. You were somewhere on the ladder. Everybody agreed on the ladder. This compound came along and pointed out that the ladder was not the only piece of furniture in the room, because a patient under this drug was not lower on the ladder. They were off it, standing beside it, holding a cup of tea, watching the ladder with mild interest. The brain was still active. Awareness was still occurring. It had simply been severed from sensation, from the body, and often from the sense of being a person located in a specific place at a specific time. The neurologists eventually worked out the mechanism, though not for another 20-odd years, and we'll get there. What matters here is that in the early 1960s, clinicians had to describe something that felt almost philosophical, using a language built for pulse rates. Dissociation was the word they landed on, borrowed from psychiatry, where it had long described the way a mind under extreme stress can wall itself off from an experience it cannot survive intact. That borrowing is worth pausing on. The word already existed to describe what happens to someone during severe trauma, when the mind detaches from the event in order to get through it. Applying it to a pharmaceutical was a quiet, enormous admission. This drug produced chemically and on demand a state the human brain normally only reaches when something terrible is happening to it. Nobody at the time phrased it that starkly. They wrote papers, they gave conference presentations. The word entered the literature and stayed there, and today an entire class of anesthetics carries it as a family name. Here is the strange part. The state itself is not always unpleasant, and this is the fact that explains everything that follows in this story. Detachment from the body can be terrifying. It can also be, for some people, extraordinarily interesting. Some early patients reported the experience as frightening. Others reported it as remarkable, dreamlike, oddly meaningful. A handful found it deeply pleasant. Medicine noted this and moved on. Other people, a decade later, would not move on. Have you ever had that half second on the edge of sleep where you can hear the room but can't remember how to move your arms? where you know you're in a bed but the bed has stopped feeling like it's under you. Stretch that from half a second into 6 hours and add a stranger in a hospital gown asking how you're feeling. That was the state medicine had just built a name for, and having named it, they now had to decide what on earth to do with a drug that produced it every single time. The answer eventually was to stop. It's time for the strangest chapter in this drug's respectable career, and it starts with a group of researchers looking at those alarming side effects and thinking, hang on, this is useful. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, psychiatry was desperate to understand schizophrenia and had almost no way to study it, because you cannot ethically give someone a psychotic illness in order to watch it happen. Then along comes a compound that produces in healthy volunteers something that looks eerily like the real thing. Flattened emotion, disordered thinking, a strange conversational distance. So they gave it to volunteers on purpose, for science, in small doses, and what they saw genuinely rattled them. You have to understand the state of psychiatry in this period to see why anyone thought this was a reasonable idea. Schizophrenia was one of the great black boxes of medicine. Nobody knew what caused it. Nobody knew what was physically different in the brain. Treatment consisted largely of the first generation of antipsychotics, which worked for some people, and institutions, which worked for almost nobody. Researchers were reduced to observing the illness from outside, like meteorologists studying a storm they could never enter. A drug that produced something resembling the illness temporarily in a controlled setting, in a volunteer who could then be asked what it felt like, was therefore not a horror. It was a laboratory. It was the closest thing anyone had ever had to a window. The formal term was a psychotomimetic, meaning a substance that mimics psychosis. Several were being studied in this era, and the field had a considerable amount of enthusiasm and a fairly relaxed attitude toward consent by modern standards. Volunteers included students, hospital staff, prisoners, and in some programs psychiatric patients themselves, an arrangement that would not survive 5 minutes in front of a contemporary ethics board. What made this particular compound so striking was the quality of the imitation. Most psychedelics of the era produced vivid perceptual effects, swirling colours, distorted rooms, an unmistakable sense of being on something. Clinically, that looks nothing like schizophrenia. Observers could tell the difference across a room. This drug produced something else. Volunteers went quiet. Their speech became disorganized in structure rather than dramatic in content. Their emotional expression flattened out. They became difficult to reach conversationally, present but oddly unavailable, answering questions in ways that were almost right and not quite. Some experienced paranoid thinking. Some described a profound sense that their thoughts were no longer entirely their own. Psychiatrists who spent their working lives on hospital wards read those descriptions and recognized them immediately. Not the theatrical Hollywood version of madness, the real, quiet, heartbreaking version they saw every day. That resemblance was scientifically enormous. It suggested that whatever this chemical was doing to the brain might be related to whatever the illness was doing to the brain, which meant that understanding one might crack open the other. It was, in retrospect, one of the most important clues psychiatry received in the entire 20th century. It also meant that a number of healthy people in the early 1960s spent several hours experiencing a borrowed version of one of the most distressing conditions a human being can have in exchange for a modest payment and a signature on a form that explained approximately nothing. The research was published, the findings were discussed, and then the whole line of inquiry was largely shelved for about 2 decades, because the tools to follow the clue did not exist yet, and the drug itself was about to become radioactive in every sense that matters to a pharmaceutical company. Psychiatry had been handed a key. It would take until the 1980s to find the door. Let's talk about the breakup. By the mid-1960s, the reports had piled up too high to ignore. Emergence reactions were not rare and they were not brief. Some patients spent many hours drifting in confusion. Some became frightened. Some became combative in ways that required more staff than a surgical recovery ward could reasonably supply at 3 a.m. The drug worked exactly as advertised right up until the moment the patient woke up, at which point it became the ward's entire personality for the rest of the shift. In 1965, human use was pulled. Medicine did not announce this loudly. Medicine simply put it back in the cupboard and closed the door. There is a particular kind of institutional quiet that happens when a large organization retires an idea it was recently very proud of. Nobody issues a statement admitting the thing was a mistake. There is no press conference. There is change in the catalogue, a note in a bulletin, a memo distributed to hospital pharmacies, and an unspoken agreement among everyone involved to stop bringing it up at dinner parties. The clinical case against it had become overwhelming, and the frustrating part was that none of the arguments touched the drug's actual performance. It still held blood pressure, it still preserved breathing, it still abolished pain with an efficiency that other agents envied. Every promise made in 1956 was being kept. The trouble was arithmetic. Anesthesia is a numbers game played across thousands of routine procedures, and a complication rate that seems tolerable in a research paper becomes intolerable when multiplied across a nation's operating schedule. If a meaningful fraction of patients spent the following 12 hours in a distressing altered state, and a smaller fraction required physical management, and a smaller fraction again experienced something they would remember with genuine fear for the rest of their lives, then you do not have an anesthetic. You have a very effective procedure followed by an unpredictable aftermath. Hospitals cannot staff for unpredictable aftermath. Hospitals can barely staff for the predictable kind. There was also the awkward matter of who was affected. The reactions appeared to hit adults harder than children, and there were suggestions that older patients fared worst of all, which is a serious problem when the elderly were precisely the population this drug was supposed to rescue. The whole selling point had been that here, at last, was an agent safe enough for the frail. Discovering that the frail had the roughest time on the other side of it removed the last commercial argument standing. So in 1965, human use ended. The compound remained legal, remained manufactured, and remained perfectly available. It simply stopped being pointed at people. Now here's the part that matters for everything that comes next, and it is worth saying slowly. The drug was not destroyed. The synthesis was not classified. The knowledge did not vanish. The chemistry had been published in the scientific literature, as chemistry always is, and the literature does not have a delete function. Somewhere in a library, in a bound journal, on a page nobody had looked at in years, were the instructions. Medicine had made a considered, responsible, entirely correct decision to stop using a substance on human beings. What medicine had not done, and could not have done, was uninvented. Within 2 years, in a city 3,000 kilometers away, somebody was going to look up that page, and the drug's second life, the one nobody ordered, was about to begin. Let's talk about the second career, which is the corporate equivalent of being moved to a desk near the photocopier. Withdrawn from human medicine, the compound was repackaged for veterinary work under the name Cernilin, and here, finally, it excelled. Monkeys, in particular, did wonderfully on it, which is why it became a favourite for primate immobilization at research facilities and zoos. No emergence reactions worth writing up, because the monkey does not file a complaint about feeling detached from the concept of its own hands. For roughly a decade, this was the drug's entire existence: a locked veterinary cabinet, a rubber-topped vial, and a very calm chimpanzee. It should have ended there. It did not end there. Veterinary anesthesia had a problem that human anesthesia did not, and it went like this. The patient cannot be reasoned with. The patient is frequently much stronger than you are, and the patient's opinion of the entire situation is extremely negative. Immobilizing a large primate for a dental examination is not a medical procedure so much as a hostage negotiation with a participant who has no interest in a peaceful resolution. Into that world, this drug arrived as an absolute gift. A dart, a short wait, and a 500-kilogram problem became a manageable one, with vital signs that stayed steady the entire time. Zoos loved it. Research facilities loved it. Wildlife veterinarians working in the field, far from ventilators and monitoring equipment, loved it most of all, because the whole point of the compound was that it did not require any of that support. And the philosophical objection that ended its human career simply evaporated. The thing that made this drug unusable in people was the people wake up and tell you about it. They remember. They describe. They are changed by the memory. A sedated baboon, whatever its inner experience, does not seek out a nurse afterward to explain that its arms had been reassigned. That is a genuinely uncomfortable observation, and it is worth sitting with rather than skipping past. The drug was never made safe. It was simply given to patients who could not complain. Commercially, this was a demotion of spectacular proportions. Cernil had been positioned as a landmark in human surgery, backed by a major pharmaceutical company, expected to become a standard agent in operating theatres across the world. Cernilan was a bottle in a locked cupboard at a zoo in Ohio, but it was a stable, respectable, entirely legitimate bottle, and for roughly 10 years the compound lived a quiet professional life. It was manufactured, it was distributed, it was regulated, it was used by trained veterinarians for defensible purposes on animals who are better off for it. The trouble with a locked cupboard is that cupboards get opened. Veterinary supplies in this era moved through a distribution network that was considerably less watched than the human pharmaceutical chain. Practices had stock, facilities had stock, deliveries were made, records were kept with varying degrees of enthusiasm, and a compound that produces profound dissociation in a human being was now sitting, in liquid form, in hundreds of buildings across the country, several steps removed from anyone who thought of it as dangerous to people. Diversion was inevitable, and diversion happened. Not on the scale that would eventually matter, because, as we'll see, the real supply problem came from somewhere else entirely, but it happened, and it put the compound into circulation among people who then talked about it. In 1978, the veterinary product would be pulled too, and the last legitimate use of this drug anywhere on Earth would end. By then, it would be far too late to matter. Let's talk about the sequel, because Park Davis was not ready to give up on the whole idea. If the problem was that the effects lasted too long and hit too hard, then perhaps the answer was a shorter, milder relative. In 1962, a chemist named Calvin Stevens synthesized exactly that, and it eventually became ketamine, a drug that would go on to save an extraordinary number of lives on battlefields and in emergency departments across the world. Same family, same fundamental trick, dramatically better manners. Ketamine got the medical career, the respectability, and eventually the redemption arc. Its older sibling got parsley, a parking lot, and 40 years of terrible press. The logic behind the sequel was sound and almost touchingly hopeful. The mechanism was clearly valuable: preserved breathing, preserved circulation, profound pain relief, all of it real and all of it desperately needed. The mechanism was not the problem. The duration and intensity of the aftermath were the problem. So build a version that does the same thing and then leaves the building on schedule. Stevens was working as a consultant chemist, and he produced a series of related compounds, one of which carried a company code that would eventually be traded in for a name that is now spoken in operating theatres on every continent. It was shorter acting. It was less intense. The strange after effects were still there, but they were measured in tens of minutes rather than in half a day, and they could be managed with other medications and a quiet room. Early human testing began in 1964, and the accounts from that period are quietly extraordinary. Volunteers came back describing a sense of floating, of separation from their bodies, of being somewhere between here and elsewhere. The now famous description of the state as a dissociative anesthesia came out of this work, and it was a wife of one of the researchers, Edward Domino, who reportedly supplied the framing that stuck. Approval followed in 1970, and ketamine went to war almost immediately. It was ideal for it. You could give it in a field with no oxygen supply, no ventilator, no anesthetic machine, and no operating theatre, to a patient who was already in shock and had already lost blood, and it would work without dropping their blood pressure into the floor. In the decades since, it has been used in emergency medicine, in pediatrics, in burn units, in disaster zones, in ambulances, and in hospitals in parts of the world where the sophisticated alternatives are simply not available. It sits on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. Two brothers, same chemical family, same fundamental effect on the brain. One became a foundation of global emergency medicine. The other became the reason a generation of American parents could not sleep. The difference between them is almost entirely duration. That is it. That is the whole divergence. One compound overstays and one leaves on time, and from that single property flow two completely opposite legacies. There's something bleakly funny in that, isn't there? We tell ourselves that reputation follows character, that things are judged on what they fundamentally are. And here are two nearly identical molecules whose entire historical standing rests on which of them knew when to go home. Ketamine would later pick up its own complicated street history, its own club scene, its own regulatory arguments, and eventually its own remarkable second act in psychiatry. It is not an innocent party in this story, but it was never the monster. It never had to be, because its older brother had already taken that job. It's 1967 now, and we're in San Francisco, where a great many people are currently trying a great many substances with enormous enthusiasm. Into this environment arrives a new tablet under the name the Peace Pill, which is where the letters PCP come from, and which is possibly the most misleading product name ever printed on a flyer. The reception was catastrophic. This was a scene that would try more or less anything, and it collectively decided within about a year that this particular thing was not for them. Word spread fast. The pill vanished from Haight-Ashbury almost as quickly as it arrived, having failed to charm the least demanding customers in America. Set the scene, because the contrast is the whole joke. The summer of love. Flowers, incense, questionable guitar playing, a neighborhood full of people who had traveled across a continent specifically to expand their consciousness, and were working through the available options with the thoroughness of a man reading a restaurant menu on holiday. The prevailing attitude toward new substances was open-minded to the point of being structurally unsound, and into this famously receptive market came a tablet that got reviewed, collectively, as absolutely not. The complaints were consistent. It was not euphoric in the way people expected. It produced numbness rather than expansion. It made people confused rather than enlightened. It occasionally made them frightening to be around. And crucially, the dosing was wildly unforgiving. So the difference between an interesting evening and a genuinely alarming one was a matter of a very small quantity that nobody could accurately measure with the equipment available in a shared house on Ashbury Street. The scene's informal information network, which was more effective than most people give it credit for, processed all of this and reached a verdict. Underground newspapers carried warnings. Street clinics saw the cases. Word moved through the neighbourhood the way word does, and within roughly a year the product was commercially dead in the place it had launched. It is genuinely difficult to fail in that market. Being rejected by 1967 San Francisco is a bit like being told your cooking is too greasy by a fairground. Here is the crucial detail though, and it is the pivot on which this entire story turns. The compound did not disappear. It failed as a branded product. It failed under its own name, sold honestly, to people who knew what they were buying and had a choice about whether to buy it again. That is a very specific type of failure, and it has a very specific solution. If your product cannot survive being sold honestly under its own name, you can either stop making it or you can stop doing those two things. The compound was cheap. The compound was easy to produce. The compound was extremely potent by weight, which meant a tiny amount went a very long way. Every economic property that a black market chemical could possibly want, it had. The only thing standing between it and profitability was its reputation. Reputations, unlike molecules, can be changed. You can change a reputation with a new name. You can change it more thoroughly by giving the product a dozen new names in a dozen cities, and you can dispose of the problem entirely by not telling the customer what they are buying at all. Somebody, somewhere, worked this out. We don't know who, and we never will. And that is the moment this drug stopped being a failed product and became something considerably worse, an ingredient. Let's talk about marketing, because what happens next is genuinely one of the great commercial pivots of the 20th century, and nobody involved had a business degree. A drug had failed publicly under one name, so it stopped using that name. Over the following years it acquired dozens of others: angel dust, hog, sherm, rocket fuel, crystal, embalming fluid, and a long list of regional variations that change from city to city and sometimes from block to block. It stopped being sold as a pill and started being sold as a powder, then as a liquid, then as something already sprinkled onto something else. And critically, it very often stopped being sold as itself at all. Think about what a name actually does in an illegal market. In a legal one, a brand is an asset. It accumulates trust. You buy the same washing powder for 30 years because the box is familiar and the box has never let you down. Reputation compounds like interest. In an illegal market, a name can be a liability because reputation compounds in both directions and there is no marketing department to fix a bad quarter. Once the word gets out that a particular thing makes people frightened and confused, the name is finished. You cannot rehabilitate it. There is no advertising campaign, no rebranding consultancy, no glossy relaunch. But you can abandon it, which costs nothing, because the name was never printed on anything in the first place. That is the strategic advantage of a product with no packaging. There is no logo to retire, no trademark to unwind, no legal department to consult. You simply start calling it something else on Tuesday, and the old name evaporates like a bad rumor about a restaurant. The proliferation was extraordinary. Angel dust became the national name, the one the newspapers used, and its origin is disputed in the usual way that street etymologies always are. But underneath it sat dozens of local variants: hog, rocket fuel, supergrass, killer weed, elephant tranquilizer, which was chemically inaccurate and rhetorically perfect, sherm in some cities, referring to a particular brand of cigarette used as a delivery vehicle, ozone, whack, peaceweed. The list runs to over 100 documented terms, and that is only the ones that made it into a report. To a researcher, this is a nightmare. If you are trying to survey drug use in a city, and your questionnaire asks about phencyclidine, you'll get blank looks and a response rate of roughly 0. Ask about angel dust, and you might get an answer, unless the local name happens to be something else entirely, in which case you are back where you started. Public health data from this period is riddled with holes for exactly this reason. To a dealer, this is not a nightmare. It is camouflage that costs nothing and applies itself. And the form changed alongside the name. The tablet was abandoned early, because tablets look like a product and products get identified. Powder came next, which could be anything. Then liquid, which could be applied to anything. Each shift moved the substance further from the category of thing you buy, and closer to the category of thing that happens to you. By the early 1970s, this compound had achieved something genuinely rare in the history of consumer goods. It had escaped its own reputation entirely while continuing to be exactly the same product. Have you ever had a company you disliked quietly change its name and carry on trading, and only found out years later? Same building, same staff, same everything, new sign over the door. Now imagine that trick performed by a chemical 100 times in 100 cities with nobody in charge of any of it. Let's talk about what you are actually buying, which is a question a shocking number of people in the 1970s could not answer. Because the powder was cheap, easy to make, and powerful in tiny amounts, it became the ideal adulterant for dealers with a supply problem and a flexible conscience. Sprinkled onto parsley, mint, oregano, or ordinary marijuana, it could be sold as synthetic THC, as mescaline, as LSD, as cannabis, as almost anything that promised an experience. Buyers had no way to check. Chemical analysis programs of the era kept finding the same thing in samples marketed as half a dozen other substances. An enormous number of people took this drug without ever choosing to. The economics here are grimly elegant, and they explain the entire decade. Imagine you sell drugs, and your supply of the thing people actually want is unreliable, expensive, or seasonal. Cannabis in the early 1970s came in from elsewhere and was subject to interdiction, weather, and every other inconvenience that affects agriculture. Mescaline required cactus. LSD required a real chemist with real skill and real equipment. Meanwhile, there is a compound you can make in a garage from legally purchasable chemicals, which is so potent that a single gram will treat an enormous volume of dried plant matter, and which produces effects strong enough that nobody complains they were undersold. You have a product with no supply chain, no import risk, near zero cost, and infinite flexibility. It is not a drug so much as a seasoning. The most notorious version was the synthetic THC swindle. In this period, cannabis's active compound had been identified and named, and there was widespread public awareness that a laboratory version existed. What there was not, anywhere, was a functioning street supply of it. So when somebody offered you synthetic THC, the honest answer to what you were holding was almost always this compound instead. Analysis programs run by street clinics and university labs, set up specifically to tell people what they had actually bought, found the same result over and over. Samples sold as synthetic THC were phencyclidine, essentially without exception. Similar results came back for samples sold as mescaline, as psilocybin, as LSD, and as several other things. Sometimes it was mixed in alongside the genuine article. Sometimes it was the entire content of the bag. Now think about the human consequence of that, because it is worse than it first appears. A person takes what they believe is a familiar substance, at a familiar dose in a familiar setting. 20 minutes later, they cannot feel their legs. The room has stopped behaving correctly, and the effect is not resolving on any schedule they recognize. They have no idea what they took. Their friends have no idea what they took. And when they reach a hospital, the hospital has no idea what they took either, because the patient is confidently reporting a substance that is not in their bloodstream. It is the pharmacological equivalent of ordering a coffee and being handed something that looks like coffee, tastes vaguely like coffee, and is in fact an industrial solvent. You would not check. Why would you check? This is also the origin of a great deal of the fear that followed. Much of the drug's terrifying reputation was built on the experiences of people who never consented to take it. Somebody who deliberately seeks out a dissociative, understands what it does, and takes a measured amount in a quiet room is having a completely different evening from somebody who thought they were smoking a joint at a party and has just lost contact with the floor. The panic of the late 1970s was real, and it was largely built on the second group. Nobody planned that. It was simply what happens when you let the profit motive loose in a market with no labels, no standards, and no comebacks. The customer was not the buyer. The customer was the dealer's margin. Everybody else was inventory. It's time to talk about supply, and this is where the story turns genuinely alarming. Most illicit drugs of the era required either a plant, a farm, a smuggling route, or a chemist with real training. This one required none of the above. The synthesis was short, the precursor chemicals were legal and cheap, and the necessary equipment could be assembled from a hardware store and a certain amount of confidence. The result was that production moved into houses, garages, motel rooms, and the occasional actual bathtub. There was no cartel. There was no import chain. There was a man, a bucket, and a set of instructions he'd been given by another man with a bucket. Every other major drug of the 20th century had a choke point, and law enforcement built its entire strategy around finding those choke points and squeezing them. Heroin needed poppies, which need land, which needs farmers, which needs a route out of the country. Cocaine needed coca, processing, and thousands of kilometers of transit. Even LSD, which is fully synthetic, required a precursor that was tightly watched and a level of laboratory technique that genuinely excluded amateurs. This compound had no choke point at all. It had a short synthesis, published openly in the scientific literature because that is what scientific literature is for, using ingredients that had every legitimate industrial reason to be sold freely. I'm obviously not going to walk through how it was made, and you wouldn't want me to at this hour anyway. What matters for the story is the shape of the problem rather than the recipe. A small number of steps, a small number of chemicals that had 100 honest uses, and no requirement for skill beyond the ability to follow instructions and not panic. The consequence was decentralization on a scale nobody had seen before. Instead of a handful of major producers who could be identified, surveilled, and eventually arrested, there were dozens, then hundreds, of tiny operations run by people with no connection to each other beyond a shared photocopied page. Take one down, and you have removed a rounding error from the national supply. There was no head to cut off. There was no organization to infiltrate. There was a diffuse cloud of individuals, most of whom did not know any of the others existed. This also meant the product varied enormously, which is where the human cost really compounds. A properly run laboratory produces a consistent substance of known purity. A man in a rented garage produces whatever he produces that week. Contaminants were routine. Incomplete reactions were routine. Potency swung wildly between batches from the same producer, let alone between producers in different cities. So the person buying was not only frequently unaware of what substance they had, they were also, even if they knew, unable to know how strong it was. Two purchases from the same person a week apart could differ by a factor that matters enormously in a drug where the gap between an effect and a crisis is measured in very small quantities. And here's the detail that reframes everything. This was not a criminal empire. There was no kingpin. There was no organization with a name and a hierarchy and a leader for a newspaper to photograph. It was a hobby that had gone horribly nationally wrong. A distributed network of amateurs, each one operating independently, collectively supplying the entire country with an anesthetic that medicine had rejected a decade earlier because it frightened people awake. Law enforcement looked at this and realized their entire playbook was useless, so they went after the ingredients instead. Let's talk about how governments respond when a drug can be made in a bathtub, because banning the drug itself had already been tried and had achieved approximately nothing. If you cannot stop the product, you go after the ingredients. In 1978, federal law in the United States took the unusual step of targeting piperidine, the key precursor, requiring records of who was buying it and in what quantity. The drug itself was also moved to a stricter schedule, and the veterinary version was pulled from the market entirely. It was a serious, thoughtful, well-designed piece of legislation. Chemistry, being chemistry, responded by finding other routes almost immediately. Precursor control is a genuinely clever idea, and it is worth appreciating before we watch it fail. The insight is that while a finished drug can be made anywhere by anyone, the raw chemicals that go into it usually come from a real industry with real factories and real invoices. Chemical suppliers are legitimate businesses. They keep books. They ship to addresses. They can be regulated in a way that a man in a garage cannot. So the strategy was not to catch the cooks. The strategy was to make it impossible to buy the ingredients without leaving a paper trail that led to your front door. Piperidine had, and has, an enormous range of perfectly legitimate industrial and pharmaceutical uses. It is not a sinister chemical. It sits in supply catalogues alongside 1,000 equally ordinary substances. The 1978 legislation did not ban it, because banning it would have caused genuine damage to legitimate industry. Instead, it required record keeping. Who bought it, how much, and where it went. This was a considered piece of policy. It targeted the actual bottleneck rather than performing a gesture. It avoided collateral damage to legitimate users. It generated intelligence that investigators could act on. The same package of measures moved phencyclidine itself into a more restrictive category and killed off the veterinary product entirely. which finally ended the last legal application of the compound anywhere in the world. 22 years after Detroit, the drug had no legitimate purpose left on Earth. And then chemistry did the thing chemistry always does. There is more than one road to any given molecule. Block one, and a sufficiently motivated person consults the literature and takes another. Some routes are harder, some are dirtier, some produce a considerably nastier product with more contaminants, but they exist. And once one person finds one and shares it, the photocopied page circulates and the network adapts. Supply dipped, supply did not stop. What the legislation did achieve, and this is not nothing, was to make the whole business more difficult, more traceable, and more dangerous for the people doing it. Investigators gained a genuinely useful tool. Some producers were caught who would otherwise not have been. The scale of the trade was constrained, but the underlying problem was never solvable by law, because the underlying problem was information, and you cannot legislate a chemical reaction out of existence. It is written into the properties of matter. You can make it illegal to perform, expensive to attempt, and risky to be caught at. You cannot make it stop being true. That's the uncomfortable lesson buried in this whole chapter, and it applies to a great deal more than one drug. Some doors, once opened, do not have a mechanism for closing. They just have a sign on them and a fine for going through. Let's talk about what it was actually like to live next door to one of these operations, because this is the part that never makes the documentaries. The smell came first, and it was not subtle. Ether, solvents, something sharp and chemical that got into curtains and stayed there. Then came the fumes, then the heat, then the very real risk of the whole enterprise going up at once, because ether is famously enthusiastic about ignition, and amateur chemists are famously enthusiastic about cigarettes. Fire departments across several American cities spent the late 1970s learning to recognize a particular type of house fire. Neighbors learned to recognize it slightly faster. Here is the thing about clandestine chemistry that television never conveys. On screen it is blue light, clean glassware, a man in goggles nodding thoughtfully. In reality it is a kitchen with the windows taped shut, a hot plate that was never designed for this, containers that used to hold something else, and a person who learned everything they know from a page that has been photocopied so many times the text has gone soft at the edges. The solvents are the immediate danger, and they are worse than the drug. Ether in particular has a vapour that is heavier than air, which means it does not politely drift out of an open window. It pools, it flows along floors, it finds its way under doors and down stairwells and collects in the lowest available space, waiting patiently for an ignition source, which in a house full of people making illegal chemicals is never in short supply. A pilot light, a refrigerator compressor kicking on, a light switch, a cigarette. The resulting fire does not behave like a normal house fire. It arrives everywhere at once, because the fuel was already distributed throughout the building before anything ignited. Firefighters in the affected cities began to develop an instinct for it, a particular smell on arrival, a particular pattern of damage, a particular kind of casualty. And then there is the exposure, which is the slower and less dramatic half of the story. People running these operations spent hours breathing an atmosphere no occupational safety regulation would permit for 30 seconds. Chemical burns on hands, persistent headaches, respiratory damage that accumulated quietly over months. The finished compound absorbs through skin quite happily, which meant that producers were frequently dosing themselves without intending to, a fact that did nothing at all to improve the quality of their subsequent decision-making. Consider that loop for a second. You're performing a delicate chemical procedure involving flammable solvents while being intermittently and involuntarily dissociated by your own product. There is no version of that which ends well. For the neighbours, it was a slow accumulation of wrongness, a smell that came and went at strange hours, windows covered from the inside, deliveries, visitors who did not stay long, an extractor fan running at 3 in, that specific, unmistakable sense that something is happening in the building next to yours, and that whatever it is not a hobby involving model trains. Most people did nothing for a long time, because most people do nothing for a long time. What are you going to say? What if you're wrong? What if you're right? Then one night the whole thing goes up, and half a street learns what was in the building at the same moment. You worry about a lot of things when you're falling asleep at night. Be quietly grateful that the composition of the air in your house is not currently one of them. It's time to talk about panic. By the late 1970s, this drug was everywhere, and the coverage arrived like a weather front. Newspapers ran it on front pages. Television specials warned parents. Officials in several cities declared it the single most dangerous substance on their streets, ahead of everything else in the catalogue. Some of this was entirely justified. Emergency room visits were climbing steeply, and the cases were genuinely difficult. And some of it was the media doing what the media does, which is finding the most extraordinary story available and then running it 11 more times. Separating those two things has taken historians roughly 40 years, and they are still arguing. The underlying data was real, and it is important to say that clearly, because the story of this decade is often told as pure hysteria, and it was not pure anything. Emergency departments were seeing more of these presentations. Federal surveys were recording rising use among young people. Toxicology screens were coming back positive in cases where nobody had expected them to. Something was genuinely happening. What happened on top of that reality was a media environment perfectly configured to amplify it. Consider the ingredients available to a producer in 1977. You have a drug with a menacing name that sounds like it was written by a screenwriter. You have a set of effects that are visually dramatic and easy to describe. You have parents who are already anxious about their teenagers. You have 3 television networks competing for the same evening audience, and you have a genuine public health problem that gives every story an unimpeachable justification. Every single incentive points in the same direction, and there is no counterweight anywhere in the system. So the coverage escalated, as coverage does. The first stories were reports, the next stories were features. Then came the specials with the ominous narration and the reconstructed footage. Then came the follow-ups, which had to be more alarming than the originals in order to justify their own existence. Then came the coverage of the reaction to the coverage. Somewhere in that escalation, the drug stopped being a chemical and became a character. It acquired motivations. It acquired a personality. It was described in language usually reserved for a villain in a serial. It lurks, it targets, it destroys. Chemicals do none of those things. Chemicals bind to receptors. That is the entire extent of their agenda. The specific claims are where things went properly loose, and we'll spend the next segment on the most famous one. But even setting that aside, the coverage systematically failed to convey the 2 facts that actually mattered most. First, that a very large fraction of the people affected had not chosen to take it, and did not know they had. And second, that the outcome depended enormously on dose, on setting, and on who the person was, in a way that a 30-second news item cannot accommodate. Instead, the message that landed was simpler and more frightening. One use. and this could be you. That message did some good, probably. Fear is a crude tool, but it is not a useless one, and some people undoubtedly avoided the drug because of it. It also did lasting harm, in ways we'll get to when we reach the courtroom. Once a substance becomes a myth, the myth starts being used to explain things it had nothing to do with, and people get hurt by explanations. The panic peaked, held for a few years, and then, as panics do, went looking for something new. The drug stayed exactly where it was. Let's head to Washington, where the response to a national panic is always the same. Assemble a committee, arrange the chairs, and ask experts to explain a chemical compound to men who studied law. Congressional hearings in the late 1970s produced testimony from toxicologists, police officers, emergency physicians and parents, and the resulting record is a genuinely fascinating document, because you can watch a government trying to understand something in real time. Some of the numbers presented were solid. Some were estimates dressed as facts. All of them were repeated on the evening news within a day, stripped of every qualifier the scientist had carefully attached to them. There is a particular theatre to a congressional hearing that has not changed in 50 years. A long table, a row of microphones, water glasses nobody drinks from, a committee chair with a gavel and a schedule, and in the witness chair a series of people who have spent their entire professional lives on a narrow question, given 8 minutes to explain it to a panel who will be voting on something unrelated by lunchtime. The scientists who testified were, by and large, careful people. Read the actual transcripts and you find them hedging appropriately, distinguishing between what was established and what was suspected, noting the limits of the available data, explaining that the drug's effects varied enormously by dose and by individual. They did their jobs properly. The problem is what happens between the hearing room and the 6 o'clock news, which is a process of compression that removes every qualifier in the sentence and keeps only the noun. A toxicologist says that in a subset of cases, at higher doses, and particularly where the substance has been taken unknowingly alongside other agents, patients may exhibit prolonged agitation requiring physical management. That is a precise, defensible, useful statement. By the time it reaches the public, it is. This drug makes people violent. Every clause that made the original sentence true has been deleted for time. The statistics had their own troubles. Estimating the size of an illegal market is notoriously hard at the best of times, and this drug made it harder than usual for a reason we've already covered. Nobody could agree what to call it, and a large fraction of users did not know they had taken it. So the surveys undercounted in one direction, and the emergency room data overcounted in another, and everybody involved knew this, and everybody involved said so, and the number that ended up in the newspaper had none of that attached. Some of the testimony was also, frankly, extraordinary in its own right. Officials from affected cities described caseloads that stretched credibility, not because they were lying, but because they were describing the worst nights of their working lives, and those nights are not a representative sample. And parents testified. That's the part of the record that still lands decades later. People who had lost children, sitting at a table in a marble building, trying to explain something unbearable to a committee, hoping it would matter. Out of all of it came the 1978 legislation, which was, as we've seen, a genuinely sensible piece of work. Out of it also came a permanent alteration in how an entire country thought about one particular chemical, most of which had very little to do with the chemical itself. Both of those things came from the same room on the same afternoons, from the same testimony. That's government. It gets a real thing done and creates a myth in the same motion, and nobody can ever quite separate them afterward. Now let's talk about the myth, because this is the one everybody knows and almost nobody has examined. The story goes that this drug grants superhuman strength, that it lets a person snap handcuffs and shrug off a squad of officers. It became the defining image of the era. The truth is more complicated and, if anything, sadder. What the drug actually does is switch off pain and switch off fear and leave a person with no functioning sense of their own body's limits. Nobody gets stronger. People simply stop receiving the signals that normally make a human being stop pulling. The damage that follows is done to themselves. Let's take this apart properly, because it is a genuinely interesting piece of physiology, and it explains almost everything about the myth. Your muscles are considerably stronger than you are allowed to use. This is not a metaphor. Your nervous system maintains a set of protective inhibitions that prevent you from generating enough force to tear your own tendons off the bone, which is a thing your muscles are entirely capable of doing. Pain is part of that system. So is fatigue. So is the ordinary background sense of where your joints are and how far they will go. Those signals are not obstacles to your strength. They are safety equipment installed by evolution, because our ancestors who lacked it kept ripping themselves apart. Now remove them. Not the muscle. The muscle is unchanged. Remove the pain signal, remove the fear response, remove the sense of your body's position, and remove the ordinary awareness that something is going badly wrong. What you get is a person applying force without any of the feedback that normally causes a human being to stop. Someone straining against restraints who does not register that they are injuring themselves and therefore does not stop and therefore continues until something gives way. And the thing that gives way is very often them. Officers of the era described struggles that seemed impossible, and their accounts were not fabricated. What they were witnessing was real. It simply was not what they thought it was. They were not watching a man become stronger. They were watching a man lose access to every internal system that tells a person to quit. The injuries tell the story. Torn muscles, dislocations, broken bones sustained by the person themselves without any external force sufficient to explain them. Bodies that were, in the most literal sense, damaged by their own effort. There is nothing superhuman in that. There is something profoundly, miserably human in it. The other half of the picture is temperature, and this is the part the myth entirely omits. The drug can drive body temperature dangerously high, and a violent physical struggle drives it higher still. Combine severe hypothermia with muscle breakdown from extreme exertion, and you have a genuine medical emergency that can kill somebody, and did. Which meant that the standard response of the era, which was to restrain and subdue as forcefully as necessary, was frequently the worst possible intervention. Every minute of struggle raised the temperature. Every minute of struggle broke down more muscle. The response to the crisis was making the crisis lethal. It took years for that to filter through into practice, and in the meantime the myth of the unstoppable man was doing enormous damage, because the myth told everyone that overwhelming force was the answer. The truth was almost the exact opposite. The truth was that the person in front of you was not a monster with impossible strength. They were somebody whose safety systems had been switched off, cooking from the inside, and every second of the fight was killing them faster. Nobody puts that in a television special. It doesn't fit the music. Let's talk about the experience itself, and let's be honest that this is where the comedy thins out. Users described numbness first, a distance opening between themselves and their own limbs, as though the whole body had been rented to a tenant who wasn't answering messages. Time stretched and folded, speech slurred. The world took on a flatness, a sense of watching everything through slightly warped glass. Some people found this pleasant. A great many found it terrifying, particularly those who had not knowingly taken it and were now trying to work out why the flaw had become a suggestion rather than a fact. The accounts from the period are remarkably consistent, which is unusual for a drug, and tells you something about how mechanical the effect is. This is not a substance that gives you a personalized experience shaped by your mood and your surroundings. It does a specific thing to a specific system, and the results rhyme across a great many different people. Numbness first, and not the pleasant warm numbness of alcohol. A dead numbness. Hands that could be seen but not quite felt. Limbs that responded to instruction with a delay, like a video call with a bad connection. Users described looking at their own arm and having to think about it in the third person. Then the distance. Not a rush, not a wave, not the sense of something arriving. Instead, a sense of something departing. The ordinary background feeling of being located in a place which none of us ever notice until it's gone. People described watching the room from a few feet behind their own head. People described their voice arriving from somewhere else. People described the specific and profoundly strange sensation of knowing they were speaking, while having no sense of choosing the words. Time went badly wrong. Minutes stretched. Sequences came apart so that events could be recalled afterward, but not in order. Some users described the same fragment repeating, or the feeling of having already been in this exact moment several times, and running through all of it. Flatness. The world drained of its ordinary emotional colouring, so that things that should have been frightening simply weren't, and things that should have been trivial became enormous. For some people this was fascinating, genuinely. There is a whole tradition of people who have sought out dissociative states deliberately because of the strange philosophical territory they open up, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise or to pretend nobody enjoyed it. For a great many others, particularly the ones who had no idea what they had taken, it was one of the worst experiences of their lives. Because here is the thing about a state that removes your sense of being a person located in a body. If you are expecting it, you have a framework. If you have no idea it is coming, you have no explanation available except the obvious one, which is that something catastrophic and permanent has just happened to your brain. Imagine that. You are at a party, you smoked something, and now you cannot feel your legs. The room has developed a delay, your voice belongs to someone else, and the only conclusion available to you is that you've had a stroke and are dying on a stranger's carpet with music playing. The panic that follows is not a side effect. It's a completely rational response to an unexplained catastrophe. That terror, multiplied across thousands of people who never chose any of it, is the real story of this drug in the 1970s. Not the handcuffs, not the strength, just a very large number of frightened people who'd been sold a lie by somebody trying to save money on their supply costs. It's time to talk about what a doctor sees because this drug leaves fingerprints. Emergency physicians of the era learned to recognize a specific combination: a blank, unfocused stare, eyes flicking sideways in a rhythm called nystagmus, and a person who was somehow both rigid and unsteady at the same time. Blood pressure often ran high, body temperature could climb dangerously, and critically, the patient might be perfectly calm for 20 minutes and then not calm at all, with no warning and no obvious trigger. Doctors described treating not a patient but a weather system. The clinical notes from the period are masterpieces of professional understatement. The eyes were the giveaway, and they became the single most useful diagnostic sign available in an era before rapid toxicology. Nystagmus is an involuntary rhythmic movement of the eyes, and it comes in several flavors depending on the direction. What made this drug distinctive was that it could produce it in every direction, including vertically, which is unusual enough that an experienced physician seeing it would immediately narrow the list of possibilities to a very short one. So you have a doctor in a busy emergency department at 2 a.m. with a patient who cannot give a history, whose friends have vanished, and whose presentation could be a dozen different things, and the eyes tell them. The stare was the other classic sign, and it is harder to describe clinically than it is to recognize. Not unconsciousness, not sleep. A person with their eyes open, looking at nothing, entirely unresponsive to the ordinary social pressure of another human face. Staff described the deeply unnerving experience of standing directly in front of someone, asking them a question, and receiving the same attention they would have received from a wall. The physical presentation was contradictory in a way that made assessment difficult. Muscle tone was often increased, so the person felt rigid, but coordination was gone entirely, so they could not stand. High tone and no control at the same time. Movements could be sudden and poorly directed. Speech when it happened was slurred and often disconnected from the conversation actually taking place. And then the vital signs, which are where the danger lived. Blood pressure high rather than low, which is the opposite of most overdoses, heart rate elevated, and temperature, which in the worst cases climbed to a level that constituted an emergency in its own right, regardless of anything else going on. But the thing that defined this drug clinically, more than any single sign, was the unpredictability. A patient could be entirely still and quiet for half an hour, requiring no intervention, and then, without any warning that anyone could subsequently identify, become agitated and difficult in a matter of seconds. Nothing had changed in the room. No one had done anything. The state simply shifted. You cannot staff for that. You cannot leave the patient unattended because they might become agitated. You cannot restrain them preemptively, because that is both wrong and, as we've seen, actively dangerous. So you sit with them, and you watch, and you wait, and you have absolutely no idea what the next hour holds. The clinical literature of the period is full of phrases like unpredictable course, variable presentation, and requires close observation, which is how doctors say we found this extremely difficult without saying we found this extremely difficult. Read enough of it, and a picture emerges of hospital staff genuinely at a loss, developing an approach on the fly, in the middle of the night, with a patient who could not tell them anything, and a waiting room that was still filling up. They worked it out eventually. The answer turned out to be almost the opposite of everything their training told them to do. Let's talk about how hospitals learned to cope, because they had to invent the protocol from scratch while it was happening. The first lesson was that talking someone down did not work, and often made things worse, because the reassuring voice was arriving in a mind that could no longer reliably identify voices as friendly. So the playbook inverted itself. Dim the lights, reduce the noise, minimize the stimulation, keep the person safe, keep them cool, keep them monitored, and above all, wait. It is one of the very few situations in emergency medicine where the correct intervention is to do dramatically less than every instinct is screaming at you to do. The talking down approach had come out of the psychedelic experience of the previous decade, and in that context it genuinely worked. Somebody having a difficult time on a classical psychedelic is usually frightened, usually suggestible, and usually enormously helped by a calm person sitting nearby explaining that this will pass and that they are safe. Street clinics in San Francisco had built an entire practice around it. It was compassionate, it was effective, and it was the obvious thing to reach for. Applied to this drug, it failed, and it failed in a specific and instructive way. The problem is that reassurance requires a functioning channel. You are relying on the person to hear a voice, recognize it as human, recognize the tone as kind, and process the meaning of the words. That is a long chain of perception and interpretation, and this drug had broken every link in it. The voice arrived as noise. The face arrived as an object. The kindness did not arrive at all. Worse, the input itself was aversive. A person whose sensory processing has come apart does not experience a soothing voice as soothing. They experience it as an intrusion from an environment they cannot make sense of. Every attempt to help added another unexplained stimulus to a mind already overloaded with them. So staff would lean in, speak gently, make eye contact, place a hand on an arm, and watch the patient become more distressed with each intervention. And, being decent people, they would try harder. The correction, when it came, was counterintuitive enough that it took genuine institutional effort to spread. Reduce everything. Move the patient somewhere quiet, ideally away from the noise and light of the main department. Dim the lights. Keep the number of people in the room to a minimum. Stop talking. Stop touching unless necessary. Remove hazards from the environment rather than removing the person from the environment, and then, essentially, stand by. Alongside that came the physical priorities, which were unglamorous and life-saving. Watch the temperature, because hypothermia was the thing most likely to kill. Cool actively if needed. Watch for the muscle breakdown that follows prolonged struggle, and get fluids in, because the kidneys were the next thing at risk. Check for injuries the patient could not feel and would not report, because a person with no pain signal can arrive with a fracture they have not mentioned and will not mention. Sedation had its place where agitation was severe, chosen carefully, because the interaction between what the patient had taken and what you were about to give them was not always predictable. But the core of it was restraint of a different kind, the restraint of the clinician, doing less, waiting, accepting that the most important treatment available was the passage of time. That is a genuinely hard thing to ask of emergency medicine, which is an entire specialty built around decisive action. Have you ever had to sit still and do nothing while someone you cared about worked through something you couldn't fix? That specific agony of hands that want a job, that was the ward every weekend for about a decade. Let's talk about the psychological wreckage, because this is the part that lingered longest. With most substances of the era, a bad experience ended when the drug wore off. This one had a habit of overstaying. Confusion could persist for a day or more. Some people experienced episodes that lasted considerably longer than any dose could explain, and a small number of users, particularly those with existing vulnerability, developed lasting psychiatric problems that outlived every trace of the chemical in their blood. Friends described people who came back not quite the same, not dramatically, just slightly, permanently, at a different angle to the world than before. Part of the reason for the persistence is chemical, and rather elegant, in a horrible way. The compound is fat-soluble, which means it does not simply circulate and leave. It gets stored in fatty tissue and released slowly afterward, so the exposure does not end when the acute effects end. It tapers off over a longer period, and in some cases people reported effects recurring days later without taking anything further. That alone explains the extended confusion that so many patients experienced. What it does not explain is the smaller and more serious group. Case reports from the 1970s describe patients who arrived in an acute state and simply did not resolve. Days became weeks. Some required psychiatric admission. A proportion of these were people who, on investigation, had a family history or a personal vulnerability to psychosis, and the most likely explanation is that the drug had pulled forward something that might have arrived anyway. That is the standard clinical framing, and it is probably correct. It is also the coldest possible comfort to anybody involved, because whether the illness was going to arrive eventually or not, it arrived that weekend at that party from that cigarette, in a person who was 17. There were also the subtler cases, which are harder to study and easier to dismiss, and which show up mostly in the accounts of the people who knew them. Friends describe someone coming back flatter, slower to laugh, a little further away in conversation, memory that had developed gaps, particularly for the period around the experience, but sometimes more broadly. A dulling that never quite lifted. Whether that represented genuine lasting change or the ordinary aftermath of a severely frightening experience is difficult to establish retrospectively, and researchers have argued about it for decades. The honest answer is that we do not fully know. What is not in dispute is that heavy repeated use was associated with lasting cognitive problems, memory difficulty, trouble with speech and word finding, and difficulty with the planning and organizing functions that let a person run their own life. Some of this improved with abstinence over months, some of it did not. And there is one more thing worth saying, and it is the thing that separates this drug from most of the others in the catalogue. Flashbacks and lingering after effects from psychedelics have a long and complicated literature, and much of it is disputed. But this drug's version had a particular cruelty to it. Because the state it produces is dissociation, the person experiencing a recurrence is not seeing colours or hearing music. They are losing their sense of being real in a supermarket on a Tuesday. Try explaining that to a doctor in 1979. Most people didn't. Most people just carried it quietly, assumed something was permanently wrong with them, and never said a word to anyone. Now let's talk about science finally catching up, which happens in the 1980s, roughly a quarter century after anyone actually needed it. Researchers identified that this drug works by blocking a specific receptor in the brain, the NMDA receptor, which sits at the heart of how neurons talk to each other using glutamate. Block it, and the ordinary conversation of the brain becomes garbled. It explains the numbness, the dissociation, the memory gaps, the strange flat distance. It was one of those discoveries that reorganizes an entire filing cabinet at once, and it arrived precisely too late to help anyone in the 1970s. To appreciate what this meant, you need to know how brains were being thought about in the decades before. Neuroscience had spent years focused on a small handful of chemical messengers: dopamine, serotonin, noradrenaline. These are the celebrity neurotransmitters, the ones that show up in magazine articles and get blamed for your mood. They are genuinely important, and drugs that act on them account for an enormous share of psychiatry. But they are, in terms of sheer volume, a minority interest. The workhorse of the mammalian brain is glutamate, which is the main excitatory messenger, and is involved in a colossal proportion of all the signalling that happens in your head. It is not the specialist, it is the infrastructure. The NMDA receptor is one of the main places glutamate delivers its message, and it is a genuinely strange piece of biological engineering. It only opens under specific conditions, requiring both a chemical signal and an electrical one at the same time, which means it functions as a kind of coincidence detector. Two things happening together open a door that neither would open alone. That property makes it central to learning and memory, because learning is essentially the brain noticing that two things happen together and adjusting itself accordingly. Now block it. Suddenly, everything about this drug's profile snaps into focus, the memory gaps, because you have interfered with the mechanism that writes memories, the dissociation, because you have disrupted the coincidence detection that binds sensory information into a single coherent experience of being a body in a place. The numbness, because pain signaling relies on these pathways, the disorganized speech, the flattening, the distance, all of it flowing from one interference at one receptor. 25 years of clinical bewilderment, resolved by a single mechanism. The work involved a number of laboratories through the late 1970s and into the 80s, and it was helped enormously by the fact that the compound was so specific. It does one main thing cleanly, which makes it an excellent research tool. The very property that made it dangerous made it scientifically valuable. And in a final irony, the drug became a standard laboratory instrument for studying the receptor it had led people to. Researchers use it, and its relatives, precisely because they know exactly what it blocks. A compound with no remaining medical use anywhere on Earth became a fixture of neuroscience benches worldwide. The Detroit chemists in 1956 had no idea any of this existed. The receptor had not been described. The neurotransmitter's central role was not understood. They made a molecule that reached into the deepest layer of how a brain assembles reality, and they did it while looking for a better way to numb an appendix. That is how science usually goes, and it is why it works. You do not find the important thing by looking for it. You find it by looking for something else and paying attention when the results come back wrong. Let's talk about the plot twist, because this failed anesthetic ended up quietly rewriting a branch of medicine. Once researchers understood the NMDA receptor connection, the psychiatric experiments of the 1960s suddenly made sense, and they pointed somewhere important. If blocking this receptor could produce something resembling psychosis, then the glutamate system had to be far more central to serious mental illness than anyone had assumed. That insight cracked open decades of research, and it eventually contributed to a genuinely astonishing development: the discovery that a close chemical relative, given carefully and in tiny amounts, could lift severe depression within hours rather than weeks. Here is what psychiatry had believed for most of the second half of the 20th century. Schizophrenia was fundamentally a dopamine problem. The evidence for this was decent. The antipsychotics that worked all blocked dopamine, and drugs that increased dopamine could produce psychotic symptoms. It was a coherent theory that explained a lot. It also failed to explain a lot, and everyone knew it. Dopamine-blocking drugs helped with some symptoms and did essentially nothing for others. The flattening, the withdrawal, the cognitive difficulty, all of it persisted. Patients on treatment could have their hallucinations reduced and still be unable to hold a conversation or organize a day. And here was a compound that produced precisely that neglected half of the picture. Not the dramatic symptoms, the quiet, disabling ones that the dopamine theory could not touch and the existing drugs could not treat. That was an enormous clue, and once the mechanism was known, it pointed directly at the glutamate system. An entire research program grew out of it, and glutamate remains one of the most active areas in the field to this day. The story is not finished. Nobody has produced the transformative treatment that this insight promised, but the map of the territory is fundamentally different because of it. And it changed because of a drug that had been thrown out of hospitals in 1965. And then there is depression, which is the part that genuinely deserves the word astonishing. For decades, antidepressant treatment operated on a timescale of weeks. You started a medication, you waited, and somewhere between 2 and 6 weeks later, you found out whether it was going to help. For most people, that is difficult. For somebody in acute crisis, it can be an impossible amount of time to survive. Then researchers, following the glutamate thread, tried the gentler sibling of our compound at a low dose in patients with severe treatment-resistant depression. It worked in hours. Not for everyone and not permanently, and with a great many complications and caveats that a responsible account has to include. It is not a cure, it requires medical supervision, and the field is still working out how to use it properly. But the fundamental observation that severe depression could lift within a single day through an entirely different mechanism overturned an assumption the discipline had held for half a century. A derivative eventually reached approval as a licensed treatment. So follow the whole line. A tired chemist in Detroit makes a compound nobody notices. It fails as an anesthetic. It terrorizes a nation for a decade. Its mechanism is finally understood 25 years late. And that understanding leads, through a chain of entirely unpredictable steps, to somebody in the depths of the worst experience of their life feeling it lift in an afternoon. Nobody designed that. Nobody could have. Let's move to the capital, where this drug found its most persistent home. Through the 1980s and beyond, Washington had a relationship with it, unlike anywhere else in the country, with its own vocabulary, its own supply chains, and its own name for a dipped cigarette that half the city recognized instantly. Local production kept prices low. Local demand kept production going. Police, hospitals, and social workers in the district developed an expertise in the drug that few other places ever needed, and they held that unwanted specialty for decades, while the rest of America's attention moved on to something newer and shinier. There is a bleak irony in the geography here that is hard to ignore. The city where the congressional hearings happened, where the legislation was drafted, where officials stood at podiums and described a national emergency, was also the city where the drug settled in most deeply and stayed longest. The reasons are the ordinary ones, and they are not mysterious. Once a local production capability exists, it persists because the knowledge stays in the community and the barrier to entry is so low. Once a local vocabulary exists, transactions are easy and newcomers are absorbed. Once a customer base exists, someone will supply it. The entire system is self-sustaining and requires no external input at all, which is precisely what made it so resistant to every intervention aimed at it. Washington also had, and has, an extreme concentration of exactly the conditions that make any drug problem worse. Neighborhoods with very little economic opportunity sitting a short distance from enormous concentrated wealth, a fractured relationship with policing, and a public health infrastructure that was chronically under-resourced in precisely the wards where it was needed most. The local expertise that developed as a result is genuinely remarkable, and almost entirely unknown outside the region. Emergency staff at the district's hospitals became, without ever intending to, among the world's most experienced clinicians in managing this specific presentation. They knew the signs, they knew the course, they knew what to do, and more importantly, what not to do, often years before that knowledge was properly written up. Police developed their own approaches, some of them good and some of them not, and the district's relationship with the drug became embedded in local culture in ways an outsider misses entirely. The vocabulary alone is a whole dialect. Specific terms for dipped cigarettes, for the liquid, for the state a person was in, all of it locally understood and largely opaque to anyone from out of town, and it lasted. That is the part that matters most. The national panic ran for maybe 5 or 6 years. Washington's relationship with the drug ran for decades, through the crack era, through everything that followed, quietly, without headlines, long after every camera in America had gone home. This is what actually happens with drug problems, and it is the least televisual fact in the entire field. They do not resolve. They do not conclude. They become a permanent feature of a place, absorbed into its infrastructure and its language and its emergency rooms, managed rather than solved, carried by the people who live there. The panic is temporary. The panic is a media event with a beginning and an end. The thing itself just stays. Let's talk about how a moral panic ends, which is almost never because the problem is solved. In the mid-1980s, crack cocaine arrived, and the national attention that had been fixed on angel dust swung away like a searchlight. The cameras left. The congressional hearings moved on. The made-for-television specials found a new subject, and the drug that had spent a decade as America's designated nightmare simply carried on existing at a lower volume in the same neighborhoods, causing the same problems, now with the enormous advantage of nobody watching. Panics burn out. The chemistry underneath them has considerably more patience. The transition is worth examining because it happens so fast and so completely. In 1982, you could not open a newspaper without encountering angel dust. By 1987, it had essentially vanished from national coverage, replaced entirely by a substance that was cheaper, more addictive, spreading faster, and, from a media perspective, considerably more photogenic. Nothing had been achieved in the meantime. The precursor legislation had constrained supply somewhat. Some producers had been caught. Public awareness had probably reduced deliberate use among people who now knew what they were avoiding. But the drug was still made, still sold, still smoked, and still filling emergency departments in the cities where it had always filled them. Its national retirement was purely editorial. This is worth understanding because it is the pattern, not the exception. Public attention operates as a fixed quantity that gets allocated to whichever story is currently most compelling, and it does not increase to accommodate a second problem. Something arriving means something else leaving. The departing problem is not required to be finished. It just has to be less new. There's a lesson in there about how societies handle anything difficult, and it is not a comfortable one. We are not collectively very good at sustained attention. We are extremely good at intense short-lived attention followed by complete amnesia. The consequences fall in predictable places. Funding follows attention. Research follows funding. Treatment programs follow both. When the searchlight moves, the resources move with it. And the communities still dealing with the old problem find themselves managing it with whatever they had before, minus the temporary help that arrived during the panic and left with it. Washington kept its problem. Philadelphia kept its problem. Los Angeles kept its problem. And the national conversation moved on entirely, so that by the 1990s, a whole generation of Americans knew angel dust primarily as a punchline in a film, something their parents had been frightened of once. Quaint in the way that old fears become quaint. Meanwhile, the emergency departments in the affected cities carried on seeing exactly the same presentations on exactly the same weekends, treated by staff who had long since stopped expecting anybody to be interested. There is something almost restful about that in a bleak way. The drug had spent 10 years as a monster in a media story. Now it got to go back to being what it always was, a chemical in some neighborhoods, causing harm to some people on an ordinary Tuesday with nobody filming. which is, if we're honest, how nearly all suffering actually happens. It's the 1990s, and it's time to talk about the strangest myth this drug ever generated. A cigarette dipped in liquid became the dominant form, and along with it came a persistent, widespread belief that the liquid in question was embalming fluid, actual formaldehyde, actual mortuary chemical. Sometimes the street name for the drug genuinely was embalming fluid, which did nothing to help. Sometimes formaldehyde really was involved as a solvent, and sometimes people were simply repeating something they had heard. Untangling what was actually in any given dipped cigarette occupied toxicologists for years and produced the least reassuring answer possible. It varied. The dipping method itself was a natural evolution. Liquid is easier to transport than powder, easier to apply and easier to conceal. A small bottle in a pocket. A cigarette dipped and left to dry for a few minutes. Regional names accumulated: Wet, Dippers, Fry, Sherm, and a dozen others depending on where you were standing. The confusion arose from a genuinely tangled set of facts, all of which were partly true. Fact 1. One of the street names for the drug itself was in some places embalming fluid, not because it contained any, but because street names are chosen for effect, and that one is extremely effective. So a person saying they had smoked embalming fluid might have meant nothing more than that they had smoked this drug under one of its many aliases. Fact 2. Formaldehyde-based solutions genuinely were used sometimes as a carrier because they were obtainable and they worked for dissolving and applying the compound. Actual mortuary supply, actually diverted, actually used. Fact 3. Sometimes there was no phencyclidine at all, and a cigarette had simply been dipped in formaldehyde on the belief that this alone produced an effect. It does something, in the sense that inhaling formaldehyde vapor is extremely bad for you and produces symptoms. It is not a recreational drug. It is a carcinogen and a severe respiratory irritant, and there is nothing pleasant available from it in any dose. So a hospital receiving a patient who reported smoking a dipped cigarette faced a genuine puzzle. They might be treating dissociation from one drug, chemical injury from another, both together, or something else entirely, because by this stage the liquid could contain more or less anything the person selling it had to hand. The uncertainty had real clinical consequences. Formaldehyde exposure and phencyclidine intoxication call for different responses, and getting it wrong wastes time you may not have. And it had cultural consequences too, because the embalming fluid detail was irresistible to anyone telling the story. It has everything: mortuaries, corpses, a whiff of the occult. It is exactly the kind of fact that spreads whether or not it is true, and it circulated relentlessly through the 1990s in news reports, in songs, in school assemblies, and in the endless informal network of things teenagers tell each other with total confidence. Which meant that by the end of the decade the average person's understanding was, there is a drug where they dip cigarettes in the stuff they use on dead bodies. Partly right, mostly wrong, utterly unshakable. You cannot correct a story that good. You can only stand next to it holding the actual facts, waving politely while it drives past. Let's talk about law, because this compound developed a second life as an explanation. Defense attorneys invoked it, prosecutors invoked it, police reports invoked it, sometimes on the basis of nothing more than a suspect behaving strangely, which is not a diagnostic test. In several enormously high-profile American cases, the drug was cited in the narrative and later found to have been absent from the toxicology entirely. It had become a story that could be told about a person, a shorthand that explained inexplicable behavior without requiring evidence. which is an extraordinarily dangerous job for a chemical to be given, and it did not do it fairly. The legal usefulness of this drug came from its reputation rather than its pharmacology, and that is precisely the problem. For a defense, it offered an argument about intent. Criminal responsibility generally requires a mind capable of forming intention, and a substance famous for abolishing rational awareness offers an obvious route to arguing that no such mind was present. How well this worked varied enormously by jurisdiction, and voluntary intoxication is generally a weak defense in most American courts, but it was tried repeatedly, and it shaped how cases were argued. For a prosecution, and for police narratives, it offered something else, an explanation for the use of force. If a suspect was described as being on this drug, then an account of overwhelming strength and extraordinary resistance became instantly plausible to a jury, because everyone in the room had absorbed the myth from television. The drug did the persuasive work. No further evidence was required, because the story was already installed in every head present. And here is the part that should genuinely concern anyone. In several of the most famous cases where the drug featured prominently in the initial narrative, subsequent toxicology found nothing. The claim had entered the record before any test was performed, and by the time the test came back, the story had already circled the world. Corrections do not travel. They never do. A correction is a small item on an inside page arriving 3 weeks after the thing everybody already knows, so the drug acquired a role it never earned, an all-purpose explanation for behavior that was otherwise difficult to account for. It became a rhetorical device that happened to also be a chemical. The people harmed by this were, as ever, not distributed evenly. An unverified claim about intoxication attaches more readily to some defendants than others, and the assumption operated exactly along the lines you would expect it to, in exactly the era you would expect it to. There is something bitterly appropriate about a dissociative drug ending up in this role. Its entire pharmacological signature is the severing of a person from their own body and their own actions. And in the courtroom it performed the same trick socially. It severed a person from their own account of themselves, replacing them with a story the room already believed. The chemical didn't do that. People did that, with the chemical's name, which is, when you think about it, the least fair thing that happened in 70 years of a genuinely unfair story. Let's talk about culture, because by the 1980s this drug had a starring role in American storytelling without ever appearing on screen. It turned up in police dramas as the reason a suspect could not be subdued. It appeared in films, in song lyrics, in public service announcements featuring alarmed narrators and unsettling music. It became the shorthand villain of the era, the thing lurking one bad decision away from every teenager in the country. And like every media villain, the version on screen and the version in the emergency room drifted steadily apart until they were barely on speaking terms. Screenwriters loved it, and you can see exactly why if you think like one for a moment. Every drama needs plausible obstacles. A police procedural in particular needs a reason why the confrontation in Act 3 cannot be resolved in 8 seconds by 4 trained officers. Alcohol does not supply that. Most drugs do not supply that. But a substance with a public reputation for making a person unstoppable supplies it perfectly, requires no explanation, and lands with an audience that already knows the rules. It was, in scriptwriting terms, free. A single line of dialogue and the scene works. So it appeared and appeared and appeared in police dramas across a decade, always in the same role, always doing the same job, and each appearance reinforced the belief in the audience, and each reinforcement made the next appearance more effective, and the whole thing spiraled without anybody ever checking a single fact. Music carried it too, particularly as hip-hop developed in the 1980s and 90s, where it appeared with considerably more nuance than television ever managed. Artists writing about the neighborhoods where this drug actually persisted described what they actually saw, which was not superhuman strength, but people damaged, families strained, and a community carrying something the rest of the country had stopped thinking about. Those accounts are frankly more accurate than the news coverage was. And then there were the public service announcements, which deserve their own small memorial. The genre reached a peak of intensity in this era. The dramatic music, the narrator with the voice of impending doom, the reconstructions filmed with a camera that would not stop tilting. The intentions were good. The effectiveness is doubtful. There is reasonable evidence that fear-based drug education performs poorly, partly because it overstates the case, and once a young person discovers that one claim was exaggerated, they reasonably discount everything else you told them, including the parts that were entirely true. And there was a great deal that was entirely true. The temperature, the self-inflicted injuries, the people who did not come back to themselves, the adulteration of everything on the market. All of it real, all of it worth knowing, all of it drowned out by a man on television with a synthesizer telling you your child could die tonight. By the end of the century, the drug was almost a period detail, a way of signalling that a film was set in the 1980s, filed alongside shoulder pads. Meanwhile, in the cities where it never left, it carried on doing the unglamorous work of harming people quietly. The monster was on television. The chemical was in the emergency room. They never once met. Let's talk about the inheritance, because this drug's descendants are still with us, and doing rather better than it did. Ketamine, the gentler sibling, sits on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines and has saved an incalculable number of lives in field hospitals and emergency rooms. Its derivative treats depression that nothing else could touch. The NMDA receptor, discovered by working out why this compound did what it did, remains one of the most studied targets in neuroscience. Meanwhile, the original compound has almost no legitimate use left anywhere on Earth, having spent 70 years being consistently, spectacularly, historically useful for absolutely everything except its intended purpose. Let's total up the ledger, because it is a genuinely strange one. On the debit side, a decade of national fear built substantially on people who never chose to take it, a great many terrifying experiences, a number of lasting psychiatric injuries, a body count that is hard to establish precisely, but is certainly not zero, a role in courtrooms it never deserved, and a persistent presence in specific communities that has outlasted every intervention aimed at it. On the credit side, a class of anesthetic that works where nothing else can, in field hospitals, in disaster zones, in ambulances, in the poorest hospitals on Earth, where the sophisticated alternatives simply do not exist. An entirely new understanding of how the brain assembles the experience of being a person, a research tool that neuroscience still uses daily, and a treatment for severe depression that acts in hours rather than weeks, which for some people is the difference between surviving a particular night and not. That ledger does not balance in any neat direction, and I'm not going to pretend it does. You cannot subtract a discovery from a death. The people harmed were not compensated by the people helped. They were entirely different people in different decades who never met. But there is something in this story that is worth carrying to sleep with you, and it is not about drugs at all. It is that nobody involved knew what they were doing, and everybody involved was, by their own lights, doing something reasonable. The chemist was making compounds. The pharmacologist was testing them. The company was pursuing an anesthetic that would genuinely have saved lives. The regulators withdrew it responsibly when the evidence demanded it. The veterinarians used it well. The legislators wrote thoughtful law. The emergency physicians invented a protocol under impossible conditions and got it right. The researchers who finally cracked the mechanism handed psychiatry one of its most important clues in a century. And running alongside all of that competence, entirely uncontrolled by any of it, a chemical was doing what chemicals do in bathtubs and garages and parking lots to people who mostly had no idea it was happening. That's the shape of it. Not a villain, not a conspiracy, just a molecule that turned out to be far more consequential than the people who made it could possibly have known, moving through 70 years of history, leaving harm and knowledge behind it in roughly equal measure, and being understood properly only long after it stopped mattering whether anyone understood it at all. So there it is. 70 years, 3 careers, 1 molecule, and a very long list of people who had no idea what was coming. Let's take a breath and look back down the road we just walked, because it's easy to lose the shape of it in the details. It started in a laboratory in Detroit in 1956, with a chemist working through a series of compounds the way you might work through a stack of paperwork on a Friday afternoon. No drama, no lightning, just a man doing his job properly, generating a family of related molecules and handing them along to somebody else to test. He had no idea. Nobody had any idea. That's the part worth sitting with as your eyes get heavy. The most consequential thing that happened in that building that year happened in silence, was written down in handwriting nobody could read, and was filed and forgotten within about a week. And the intention behind it was good. That's the part that so easily gets lost. Nobody in that laboratory was trying to invent a nightmare. They were trying to stop people from dying on operating tables, which is one of the more admirable projects human beings have ever undertaken. Before this compound, anesthesia was a genuine gamble, a slow, careful negotiation between unconscious and dead, with one pedal that served as both the accelerator and the brake. People with weak hearts were told their operable conditions were inoperable, purely because nobody could safely put them to sleep for long enough to fix them. That was the problem on the whiteboard. That was the goal. A drug that took away the pain without taking away the patient. And for a few extraordinary months they thought they'd done it. Cernil, named after serenity, which remains one of the great optimistic misjudgments in the history of pharmaceutical branding. The animal data was beautiful. The surgeries were beautiful. The vital signs held steady in a way that made experienced anesthesiologists check the equipment twice. Everything worked exactly as promised, right up until the moment the patients woke up and started describing a place that wasn't there. That's where medicine had to go and invent a word. Dissociation. Borrowed from psychiatry, where it already described what a mind does when something happens to it that it cannot survive intact. A patient awake, eyes open, capable of speech, and entirely absent. A body having surgery, and a person somewhere else with no forwarding address. It took medicine until 1965 to admit that this was not a manageable side effect, but the drug's actual signature, and then they did the responsible thing and quietly put it back in the cupboard. No announcement, no apology, just a change in the catalogue and a decade in a veterinary cabinet, calming down monkeys who couldn't file complaints. And it should have ended there. It really should have. But you can withdraw a product and you cannot uninvent a molecule, and the instructions were sitting in a library, in a bound journal, on a page that anybody with a library card could photocopy. So it came back. It came back as a pill in San Francisco that even 1967 San Francisco rejected, which is a genuinely difficult achievement. And then it did the only thing left available to a product that cannot survive being sold honestly. It stopped being sold honestly. It shed its name, acquired 100 others, stopped being a pill, became a powder, became a liquid, became a thing sprinkled onto parsley and sold as something else entirely to people who had no way of knowing and no way of checking. It stopped being a drug you buy and became a drug that happens to you. That's the fact I'd like you to keep out of everything in this story. Because when America lost its composure in 1977, when the front pages ran and the specials aired and the men in suits assembled in Washington to be frightened at each other, the terror they were describing was overwhelmingly built on the experiences of people who never chose any of it. Somebody at a party who thought they were smoking one thing and 20 minutes later could not feel their legs, could not locate the floor, and had no explanation available except that something catastrophic had just happened to their brain. That panic wasn't a side effect. That panic was a completely rational response to an unexplained disaster, and it was manufactured ultimately by somebody trying to save money on their supply costs. The myth that grew out of it was almost the exact inverse of the truth. The unstoppable man, the impossible strength, and the reality underneath was so much sadder and so much more human. Nobody got stronger. People simply lost access to every safety system that tells a human being to stop pulling. Pain, fear, fatigue, the ordinary sense of where your joints end. Take those away and what's left is a person injuring themselves without ever receiving the message that they should stop. The injuries were self-inflicted. The bones that broke were their own. There was nothing superhuman in that room. There was somebody cooking from the inside while everyone present believed they were fighting a monster, and the correction, when it eventually came, was almost the opposite of every instinct. Not more force, less. Dim the lights, quiet the room, stop talking, stop touching, watch the temperature and wait. Emergency physicians had to learn, in the middle of the night, with no protocol and no training, that the most important treatment available to them was the passage of time. That is a genuinely hard thing to ask of people whose entire profession is built around decisive action. They did it anyway. They worked it out. On the ward, at 3 a.m, weekend after weekend, and most of them never got so much as a paper out of it. Then science finally caught up 25 years late and explained everything in a single stroke. One receptor, the NMDA receptor, sitting at the heart of how neurons agree that two things happened at once, which turns out to be how a brain assembles the experience of being a person in a place. Block it, and the memory gaps make sense, and the numbness makes sense, and the terrible flat distance makes sense. A quarter-century of clinical bewilderment resolved by a mechanism nobody in 1956 even knew existed. And out of that came the strangest gift in the whole story. Follow the thread from that receptor, and you arrive, eventually, at somebody in the depths of the worst experience of their life, with a depression that has resisted everything, feeling it lift in a single afternoon. Nobody designed that. Nobody could have designed that. It came out of a failed anesthetic, by way of a national panic, by way of a laboratory curiosity that a tired chemist made by accident while looking for something else. The ledger doesn't balance. I want to be honest about that as we wind down. You cannot subtract a discovery from a death. The people harmed in the 1970s were not compensated by the people helped in the 2020s. They were entirely different people in different decades who never met and never will. The neighborhoods where this drug settled in and stayed kept it long after the cameras left, managed it quietly for decades with whatever resources they had, and were never thanked for the expertise they were forced to develop. But there's something in this story that I find, at this hour, oddly comforting, because almost everybody in it was doing their best. The chemist was making compounds. The pharmacologist was testing them carefully. The company withdrew the drug when the evidence demanded it, at real cost to itself. The legislators wrote thoughtful law that targeted the actual bottleneck. The nurses sat in dim rooms with frightened strangers and did nothing on purpose, because doing nothing was the correct and hardest thing. The researchers who finally cracked the mechanism handed psychiatry one of the most important clues it received in 100 years: competence all the way down. And running alongside all of it, entirely uncontrolled by any of it, a molecule doing what molecules do, in bathtubs and garages and parking lots, to people who mostly had no idea it was happening. That's not a story about villains. That's a story about how the world actually works, full of people trying hard in good faith, with incomplete information, watching the consequences of their work escape them and travel somewhere they never imagined. So tonight, as you lie in your bed, in a room where the air is safe to breathe and the floor is exactly where you left it, spare a thought for the ones in this story who didn't get an easy time of it. The patients in 1959 who woke up in a recovery ward and couldn't find their own hands and had no word for what had happened to them because the word hadn't been invented yet. The 17-year-old at a party who smoked something they thought they understood. The night nurse sitting in the dark, watching, waiting, doing nothing correctly. The neighbours who smelled ether at 3 in the morning and didn't know what to say. And the chemist in Detroit who went home that Friday having done nothing remarkable at all, and who altered the next 70 years without ever knowing he'd touched them. Because that's the quiet truth underneath all of this. Most of history isn't made by people who knew what they were doing. It's made by people doing ordinary work carefully, on ordinary afternoons, and then finding out much later what it became. You'll wake up tomorrow with your hands exactly where you left them. Your legs will report for duty. The floor will still be a fact rather than a suggestion, and the ordinary, unremarkable business of being one continuous person inside one continuous body will carry on without you having to think about it once, which is a small miracle running quietly in the background of every single day you've ever had. That's worth something. That's worth quite a lot, actually. Sleep well. Thank you for spending this time with me, and thank you again to whoever suggested this one, because I'd never have gone looking for it myself. If you enjoyed it, you know where the buttons are, but only if you actually did. Good night.